Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 89, and my name is Dan Lizette. Thank you guys for taking a few minutes to check out this show, and it's a good one. I'm really excited to bring all of you this conversation for this week. As you guys know from checking out the episode title, this week's guest is Jonathan Mitchell from The Truth and Radiotopia. Jonathan Mitchell is one of the podcast producers and hosts who I've envied for a very long time, and it was a real privilege to talk to Jonathan, and he shares with me and all of us a lot of great stories going behind the scenes of The Truth, how it started, his upbringing, his career prior to the launch of the podcast, and sort of all the seeds that came together to make one of the best shows in the podcasting space right now. So you guys are in for a treat, as I was when I spoke with Jonathan a few days back. Folks, I wanted to also just remind you guys that if you are enjoying the show, please take just a minute and a review in iTunes or Google Play or on Stitcher or whatever your listening vehicle of choice is. Would be greatly appreciated. It helps make the show a little more visible to other folks who want the same kind of great interviews and conversations about some of their favorite podcasts, and it allows the show to get discovered by more people, and that's kind of a cool thing. I really enjoy the fact that a lot of you have told me that you've enjoyed a lot of these interviews and these conversations, and it kind of just makes all the time, effort, and energy that I put into this each and every week kind of mean that much more. So that'll be it. No other information. I know I've gotten a lot of great feedback from you guys in the past few weeks. My conversation last week with Dan Franks from Podcast Movement is one in particular. A lot of you guys have told me that you learned a lot more about the convention, and some of you I may be joining up with when I'm there in Chicago the first week of July. So it should be a great experience, and I'm really looking forward to it. So check out the back catalog, folks. Lots of great stuff out there. Let's not put this off anymore. Let's get to my excellent conversation. Jonathan Mitchell from The Truth. Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. As I mentioned up front, my guest this week, one that I am super interested in talking about. In fact, as longtime listeners of the Podcast Digest knows, I've been mentioning this show again and again and again. I mentioned it in my conversations with Hilary Frank, with Roman Mars, and just a couple weeks ago with Jonathan Mann and Songonauts. Songonauts was a collaboration and is a periodic series that will be, or episodic series that will be appearing on The Truth. And today, my guest is the host and creator of The Truth, Jonathan Mitchell. Jonathan, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me, and I will apologize in advance, as I can and probably will go a little fanboy with The Truth. I have spoke about it often, and I'm a huge fan. It is one of those ones that once it appears, it automatically goes to the top of my playlist, and that's a big, long playlist usually. But before we jump into the show, I want folks to kind of get to know Jonathan a little bit, sort of tell folks a little bit about your years before coming to The Truth, sort of what's your background, where are you from, how'd you grow up, all those fun things.
Sure. Okay, that's a long story. Yeah. So I've been a radio producer professionally for about 20 years, and I started The Truth sort of around, I guess, started really making steps towards making a podcast like this around 2009. So that's maybe 5 or 6, maybe 7 years. I grew up, starting from the beginning, I grew up in Springfield, Illinois. I was born and raised there. My family still lives there. My background's in music, primarily. My dad was a musician. When I was growing up, he was the organist and choir director at a Presbyterian church. And he required that I take piano lessons and be in the choir all throughout my childhood. I was basically required to take piano lessons up until I graduated from high school, and then when I got to college, they required me to take piano lessons because I was a music major, and so I was required to take piano lessons until the age of 21. So, and at least half of that time, actually way more than half of that time, I did not want to take piano lessons at all. But it ended up working out for me. I was also very interested in theater growing up. I always really liked storytelling. I was always drawn to that kind of thing. I went through these various phases as a child where at first I was interested in magic, and then I was interested in puppets, and then I was interested in computers and making video games. But then by the time I got around to being a teenager, I got really into pop music, and all of a sudden the music training that I was getting became really useful because I really wanted to be in a rock band. And my dad, as I said, was a musician, and he composed a lot of music. He had a number of choral anthems published in the 70s. And so we had a lot of like manuscript paper sitting around the house, like blank manuscript paper, and I really wanted to be able to use it. I wanted to understand how to write music, and it was a big mystery for a while, like how to do that. And so I became very, very interested in figuring it out. And as soon as I sort of got a foothold in that, it became like my obsession all through high school. I just wrote songs all the time, and wrote all kinds of music, really. And I was also very, very involved in theater. And so by the time I went to college, that was basically all I could do was make music. And so I majored in music composition, and it was really through music that I became interested in radio, because I guess I'll give you the longish version of the story, since you asked.
Please.
So I was, as I said, I was a music major, and I was really not feeling it a little bit after 2 years. I was really not knowing if it was really what I wanted to do. And I was going to a school that was really modernist, we were very, very discouraged from writing tonal music. We were, I took classes in serial music, and it was a lot of very, very serious avant-garde 20th century classical music that I spent a lot of time trying to just decipher and wrap my head around what it even was about. And I was just sort of thrown in the middle of that and didn't know what to make of it. And so I spent a couple years really trying to find my bearings in that. And at a certain point I was thinking, well, maybe I'll change my major. I also liked art. I thought, well, maybe and I took I spent one summer, I took a graphic design class to see if I would like it. And I loved it. And I just really, really liked making things with my hands like that. And so I had just one class. I had a recording studio class the next semester that I had signed up for already. And I was really, really looking forward to that. And so I said, well, I'll go through with the recording studio class and see how it goes. And if I like it, then I'll stick with music. And I took that recording studio class, and it was like love at first sight. I mean, I had never loved anything as much as I loved working in the recording studio. And as soon as the first time I ever edited tape, I felt like I had found it. I'd found my thing. It was like this amazing magic trick to edit tape, to create this thing that only existed because I like it. It sounds like it happened that way, but in fact, I created the event. You can make these edits and no one would know you edited it. It was a revelation to me. And I also like the very tactile nature of editing tape. I like that you were making an object that represented time, like something that existed in time. And so I got very, very interested in that. I was basically learning the recording studio through studying the history of experimental electronic music. And the way that my professor, Scott Wyatt, who was probably one of the biggest influences on my life, he still teaches there at the University of Illinois. And the way that he taught electronic music was by teaching us the history of experimental electronic music. So we would first do a project using all technology that was available, maybe like post World War II, and then we'd do a project that was maybe using technology that was around during the 50s, and then we'd do a project using technology that was around in the 60s. And so the first project we did was a musique concrète piece. And musique concrète is taking sounds from the natural world and using the tools of the recording studio to manipulate them into musical material. So that would be like reversing them and editing them and slowing them down, running them through effects, that kind of thing, and filtering them. And so that I just loved that. I loved the idea that I could use any sound in the world and make it into something that was unrecognizable but still retained this very natural feel to it, very very sophisticated frequency and content. It had a life to it, but it also sounded otherworldly. And so that became my focus really for the next few years, was making music by recording sounds and then manipulating them around. And I was very drawn to speech as a sound source because it's very colorful. You have very percussive sounds, and you also have pitched vowel sounds, and it changes very frequently. But it also has this meaning attached to it, and so you have this very like linguistic meaning, but then you could make very, very abstract sounds of it as well. So there was sort of this continuum between the linguistic and the abstract that I found really appealing. And so I started interviewing people for my pieces, and became very interested in storytelling by using these sort of experimental electronic music techniques. And I, after doing that more and more, as I began to do that more and more, I became much more drawn to the storytelling aspects of it. It just spoke to my interests more directly, I guess. And around the same time, I was also very, very interested in film and filmmaking. And when I was a sophomore in college, I had seen a film, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, the Steven Soderbergh film. And this would have been 1989. And I loved that film. The thing about it that I think I loved the most was that it was very simple. It looked like it was relatively easy to make, yet it had such a strong emotional impact. And it made filmmaking seem so accessible. Here's this like 26-year-old guy who just went out and he made a film, and then I was looking at it in my movie theater in Champaign, Illinois, and I thought it was an amazing film too. It just really captivated my attention and my imagination, and so I found, when I was in a bookstore, I found a book that he had written, which was basically a journal that he kept while he was making that film, and along with the shooting script of the film. And I read that thing cover to cover twice. I as soon as I saw that the library at the university had a laser disc of Sex, Lies, and Videotape, I went back and I watched that, and it had, in those days, this is like before DVDs. This is, and so like special
big ones.
Yeah, this is the big ones, like the LP-sized discs. And this is in the days when like the special features on a DVD were a really very novel thing. Like you could only get those on those big laser discs, and it had one of his student films, one of his short student films, and a lot of interviews about the making of it. And first time I'd heard director's commentary. And I just got very obsessed with that film and how it was made and the process of making films. And it just made me really, really want to make a film badly. And so I wrote a short film script, and all kinds of stuff. And I really wanted to make one. But this is, like I said, this is like 89, 90, 91, right around that time. And in order to make a film in those days, you really needed access to expensive equipment. It wasn't like today where you could just do it with your phone. It was like, if I wanted to make a 60 millimeter camera, how was I going to do that unless I had access to one through some kind of university or,
Right.
And so I would apply for the film making class every semester and never get in because there was only one class and it was a big school with like 30,000 students, So, I could never get into the film class, and I was just frustrated with that, and I wanted to do it so badly. And then I thought, wait a minute, I'm taking a recording studio class. I could make a film without pictures, I could do that today. What if I did that? And the more I thought about it, the more appealing it became because I thought of all these techniques I was learning about. And thinking about all the experimental music I was being exposed to, and a lot of it used speech in very innovative and creative and avant-garde ways, especially the pieces of Steve Reich and the tape loop pieces he was doing. And I was just really got very excited by the idea. I thought I think I'd like to see what I could do with that, and so I went to grad school at Mills College in Oakland, California, and I made my thesis project a radio drama, which I wasn't like thinking of it in terms of radio drama, but that's basically what it was. And I wrote all the music for it, and I recorded all the sounds and did all the sound design for it, and I worked with a writer on it, and so that was my thesis project, and that was sort of my radio school, I guess. I just sort of, it was like the piece itself, I don't think came out all that great. I mean, there's a lot of things wrong with it, but it was like a kitchen sink type of thing, where I was just had all these ideas about how to use sound in a with storytelling. And I just was wanting to explore all these different recording studio ideas I had. And so it was just, it was like a burst of energy, and I got, I spent a long time on it. And by the time I finished, I guess I had developed a lot of these kinds of skills. I directed actors, and I had recorded all kinds of music and worked with musicians, but I'd also done a lot of electronic music stuff with it, and did a lot of sound design. And this was in the very, very early days of nonlinear editing, so that was when I was first starting to use Pro Tools. Right. And so I needed a job, and I got this job editing what were basically corporate audio tapes. It was just like interviews between, like, say, the VP of sales and the guy who sold, the top sales that month for like Sun Microsystems or something. They were mostly
it was riveting audio.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying.
It was great. Yeah, it was like high tech companies, and it was like internal stuff. It was not interesting stuff, but but the thing about it was that the things we were making were recorded and made to kind of be in the format of a talk radio show. And so in between the interviews, they'd have these little musical transitions, and because the editing of these interviews was so kind of boring and just not interesting, I would really get into making these transitions because it was like the one fun part of the job, right?
Right.
And so I would get into like choosing just the right music and making it like sound really nice and pretty, and maybe even putting a little like fake station ID type of thing, you know. And
something tells me they must have loved this.
Yeah, they loved it. They loved it, and so they also actually made radio shows, like legitimate radio shows. And so my boss got a grant to do a technology show for public radio, and he hired me to be the creative director of that. And so that was basically my first real radio job.
Let me go back a little bit here, Jonathan. You touched on a number of things that I wanted to kind of explore a little bit, but I guess one of the main ones would be, because I'm going to bet that somebody listening to this now or in the future is going to hear that story and could find themselves in a similar situation where maybe they're in school and this idea of audio-based storytelling is something that really intrigues them because maybe they grew up on podcasts, right? This has been a thing for them, for the last 10 years, and it's something they really want to pursue as they're going through, their high school days or college days. What was, for you, in your experience, what was your external support like when you had this idea of kind of film without pictures and maybe you could kind of work towards something like that? Was this something that your peers and teachers and professors supported, or because at that time, I'm imagining, and you talk about this in one of your Transom articles I want to touch on a little bit later, but radio dramas were kind of at least typically looked at as something of yesteryear. But you obviously wanted something more modern and in today's world. So what was that like with sort of all the external voices around you, and kind of how did you use that to propel yourself forward?
Well, I never felt like I wasn't supported. I felt like whatever I said I wanted to do, usually I was in environments where people were like, yeah, try that, go for it. And I felt that whenever I did things, I usually got a good reaction from the results. And so I was encouraged, I got a lot of positive reinforcement. And like when I was making the radio drama in grad school, I didn't call it a radio drama really. I was thinking of it more as I was like exploring. I called it an opera without singing. I was exploring what I could do with spoken text, but trying to find a musical way of presenting just natural spoken dialogue. And I was doing a lot of very experimental things with it too. I mean, it wasn't like straight ahead radio drama. It was like for example, one scene, I recorded it in my kitchen, and then I had heard this Alvin Lucier piece called "I'm Sitting in a Room," which is it's a classic electronic music piece where he reads this text, and then he plays a recording of him reading that. He plays that recording back in the same room that where he recorded it originally, and records that. Okay. And then he does that generation after generation after generation. So by the 20th generation, all you're basically hearing are his voice activating the resonant frequencies of the room. And it's like this disintegration, this sort of, consumption of his speech into the frequency content of the room. It's a very beautiful idea, very elegant. And so I really loved that idea. And so I thought, well, what if I did a scene where I recorded it in my kitchen and then applied that technique and took the recording, the end product, like the 20th generation, so that I'd have just that scene, but in the resonant frequencies of the room. And then what I did was I presented the scene where it started normal, and then I gradually mixed in the room frequencies, and I gradually mixed out the original scene, so that by the end of the scene, all you're hearing are the room frequencies, and with the idea that you're kind of feeling that way about the characters and the situation. You're feeling kind of suffocated by it, and so that's the kind of stuff I was exploring. It wasn't like a it was a nonlinear kind of thing where I was just like, what's a musical thing I can do with sound, speech, you know?
But you would recommend that if somebody has this idea to pursue it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah. There's no reason not to. It's yeah. I mean,
Well, I think about it because I wonder sometimes, and a lot of this comes from personal experience, I'll be honest with you, Jonathan. All growing up, all through school, I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. And I turned myself off of it because at some point, talking to high school guidance counselors or hearing what other kids in high school were planning on doing with their lives, at some point I said, you know what, it's too much trying to be like a movie star. And I came up with a different plan. And I've been in business ever since, people management, data entry, that type of world during the day. And it took me, sort of 15, 18 years later to kind of come back around and start to, through this podcast, bring back little bits and pieces of that. I don't know how many times I've looked back at that idea and say, you know what, especially as I get the chance to talk to people like you and Roman and Hillary and all these great creative people who've sort of, one kind of common strain I see through it is this sense of sort of following your dream, getting in tune with what you want to do, and sort of having that vision and never giving up on it and keep driving through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like I guess I was fortunate in that I didn't have a lot of other options. We
had all those piano lessons you had to take. You were required to.
Yeah,
so.
right.
Right.
Yeah, I always feel like I ended up here because I always just was taking the best possible option that was available to me. I didn't really get good grades in high school. I couldn't really follow an academic path and go to a good school. But if I followed music, I could go to a really good school. Is that kind of thing. I couldn't really get a job, a high-paying job out of college because I had studied music, but I could get a decent job editing tape because I knew how to do that, It just happened. It was just a combination of what was available to me and what I happened to be good at.
You mentioned editing tape, and it's so funny because it sounded like you were the missing third person in the room from the same conversation I had with the Kitchen Sisters.
Uh-huh.
They talked a lot about editing tape, and I asked them specifically, did they miss that? In terms of that technology obviously has evolved since the physical assembly of that tape. Yeah. And what do you think? Is that something you said, the actual act of building something, is that something you kind of look back with a lot of warm feelings on?
Yeah, totally. I miss parts of it. I think what I do now is definitely informed by that, but it's like you can do so much more sophisticated things. I don't know. The medium, the materials, the way that you work really does like affect what you end up with and the decisions you make. Like what and I do miss that. When I was in college, I was using with these old analog synthesizers that were built in the 60s. And because of the way that they're built and the particular modules we had available to us, I was kind of gravitated towards using them in a particular way that is completely not anything I would think to do today. I just wouldn't, it wouldn't make sense even to do things like I was doing them. And so I end up with something that sounds completely different. And so it really does affect what you end up with. But really, it's just like at any situation, you're just working with the options you have in the most creative way you can think of, and you just sort of,
Yeah, we moved on from Laserdiscs to Blu-rays.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So post-grad school, Jonathan, you mentioned a little bit on the company with the technology show, but take us sort of from those days up to the Truth. How did the road look from there to when you got the idea for the Truth? Obviously, we can kind of see a lot of the seeds in your past on kind of this whole concept taking place, but what was that interim time looking like?
Between the time when I started working in radio and the time I started the Truth.
Yeah.
It actually didn't change a lot, once I started using Pro Tools, I still use Pro Tools today. So I guess I've been using it for over 20 years. And, it just like very, very incrementally. Back in those days, our masters were DATs, and now you don't use DATs anymore. They're completely, unreliable and mechanical, not a good medium. But, that's basically it. I mean, I think of it like when I think of like what's changed for me in those years, it's really more about my storytelling has gotten stronger. Like I have a better idea about how to tell a good story and what I'm looking for and what will satisfy me as being, a finished piece or a good idea. And so what is an idea worth pursuing is something that's changed a lot for me.
So how was the truth born? How did this idea begin?
I had done the thesis project, and so I knew I wanted to do that. I really wanted to keep doing that, and I wanted to find a way to do that somehow. I thought it was a good idea. I didn't see a lot of other people doing it. I mean, people were doing radio drama, but people were doing radio art, and people were doing speech-based experimental pieces and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't really hear anything that was like what I wanted to hear. Like I had something in mind that I wanted to do that I thought could work, or at least I wanted to see what I could do. I wanted to sort of follow that sort of vision, I guess, I had for it. And so I was working in radio, and this was like 96, 97, and This American Life was just starting. And it was like this brand new show. It was this sort of breath of fresh air that was, different from everything else on the radio. It was like someone who's really being very successful at using radio as a creative medium. And it was very inspiring in that way. Like he got public radio to let him do this really creative thing, and there was a huge audience for it. And so this was inspiring to all kinds of people at that time. I mean, after that, you saw all these shows popping up that were like wanting to be the next This American Life. It was a very, it was like a, explosion kind of lightning bolt thing for the whole kind of radio production sort of community, I guess you'd say. And so that was very encouraging. That made me think, well, maybe I could make a show that's like a radio drama show, like the kinds of stuff I want to do, And I was on the computer show that we were working on. One of the things that I did regularly was I helped work on a website review, and we looked for. That was like my excuse to do radio drama, kind of like sneak it in. And I like used all kind, like we had in that production house, we had like all kinds of sound effects and all kinds of production music that I have a reason to use in these corporate audio tapes. But in this, like these website reviews and other stuff, whatever I could find, really, I would look for ways of using the sound effects because they were so cool. And you'd come across these little music bumpers or something that you could say, oh, I could imagine how that's supposed to be used. And so I try to like create situations where I could use that because I could, I just wanted to scratch that itch, I guess. And so I was doing as much as I could, doing these little bursts of radio drama every week, and each piece was like an exploration of a different genre, and I was really just had all this energy to explore. I just wanted to do every genre I could think of in audio, and I was working with this my collaborator, my co-producer on this, his name's Taylor Fogelquist, and he did all these voices really well. He has a great voice, and he could do all these characters, and so we do these little stories where he'd play every character, and we just get really into it. It was really fun, and they sounded good, and so they got encouraged. They didn't say stop doing that, don't get back to work. They're like, oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah, do that some more, And so maybe a little bit they were like, you're really spending too much time on that. But I'm like, no, but it's cool. It's cool. and then I'd like stay. I'd like at a certain point I'd be like, well, I'll just do it on my off hours. And I was like in my 20s, and so I just had so much energy. It didn't seem abnormal to me to like stay up all night and just work on something. I had the stamina for that, I guess. And so I would like when a show was due, I would just stay up all night finishing it, like literally stay up all night. And the reason I would have to do that is because I wanted to do these little audio drama things that took a lot of time. And so I was really into that. And I always had that as an idea. And then like the next show I worked on was a children's literature show, and it was a very similar situation where I tried to work in ways of having the actors read the books and make these little stories, and I'd cut them with interviews with the authors or illustrators, and then I did a lot of arts pieces for a while and got very, very into making documentaries. I started doing a lot of work for Studio 360, which is an art show produced at WNYC, and I started freelancing for all kinds of shows. And I produced a documentary about abortion called Shades of Grey that ended up generating a lot of opportunities for me. Like a lot after I made that piece, I all of a sudden got approached to work for shows, and got a lot of really great opportunities to meet interesting people and travel and do documentaries, and things were going really great. And so I decided to move to New York. I was living in Oakland still, and so I moved to New York in 2004. Started doing even more freelance work, just living off of that. Helped create a show with a friend of mine, Carrie Hillman, called Fair Game. She really created it, and I was sort of helping her. I was sort of there along for the ride, but doing whatever I could to help. And it was like a sort of a nightly, I guess you'd call it a daily show for public radio was the sort of the concept. And we worked with all kinds of great writers on that. And we had amazing, like, people who went on to become more famous than they were when they were working on the show. Like Jason Mantzoukas was a regular commentator. Nick Kroll was a guest host. Michael Ian Black was a guest host. Faith Saley was the host, and the writers. It was just really great. We had Mike Birbiglia came in and did a piece. John Mulaney came in and did a piece. Chelsea Peretti came in and did a piece. And so we had just all these great people, and we could. It was fun because it was like a pop culture show, and so I could, try to think of fun stories to do, and that was my job for a while. That was like the hardest I ever worked was on that show, because it was just like a daily show is just so exhausting,
right?
And so there was that, and then after that I worked for Radiolab for a little bit and got to see what that was like. And all the time I'm doing all these jobs and thinking, I really want to do my own show. I really want to do this radio drama show. And trying to figure out how I was going to make that happen. And thinking, well, I'm getting to know the ropes. I'm getting to know, how these things actually do happen, and how I would logistically have to, what I would have to do to make that work. And so working at Radiolab was really interesting because it was interesting to see how Jad put the pieces together and thought of it and be challenged. He's very, very smart, very, very brilliant producer, and that really shaped I think in a very important way, it shaped the way that I think critically about my own work.
Was there stylistic pieces you picked up from them? Because I've always looked at Radiolab as having a very particular tone and style.
I felt, honest, my feeling about it, I feel like a lot of those things were things that were already in my work. Like if you listen to the abortion piece I did back in 2003, like a lot of the techniques that I used in that piece, I think are there in Radiolab.
So you felt a kinship with those folks, basically.
Yeah, a kinship, I guess you call it. Like we wanted to do the same kinds of things. That's. I felt like they were more like peers, or Jad was a peer, I'm not sure how he saw it. I mean, he may have seen it differently, but it was more that I saw how much they edited the hosts, how much it's that they approached the writing process of the pieces in a very iterative way. They would, gather a lot of tape, and then the producer would sort of try to make a coherent piece out of that. And then they would, so then based on what tape you knew you wanted to use, they'd have, like, the reporter would come in and talk to Jad, and they'd sort of talk through the piece and what we thought was the arc of the story. And then you'd take that tape and then you'd edit it with the tape you'd edited from that the reporter had collected to try to make a piece out of that. And usually there were pieces missing. And so then you'd go back and you'd have them retrack it. Maybe the reporter would have to come in again, or maybe it was all stuff that Jad could do, and you could, make it sound like they were talking to one another. But we could fix it by just recording his side of it,
Right.
And then you'd maybe go through that a few times. You'd play it for the group, and then you'd want to change other things, and so it was that form of writing, like really, really trying to get directly with the sound, work directly with the sound, and let the sound drive the writing of the piece. That was really the big influence on me. And so working on that show, it's really Jad's baby, Jad and Robert. And I felt like there were a lot of things I wanted to do that I just would never, ever have the opportunity to do in that environment. And it just made me want to do my own project even more. By the end of the time I was working there, I was like, if I don't start my own project now, I don't know when I'm going to, because this is like, I don't want to have to go through that again. I want to be doing my own thing. I feel like there's something inside me that will never really be satisfied until I at least try to do my own thing. And it's just like a burning desire I knew I had, and I had always had. And I felt like it didn't, like there was something that was not quite real about that until I actually did it, Like it's one thing to say, oh yeah, I should do my own thing, and it's another thing to like be doing it. And I felt like I couldn't really even respect that desire in myself until I actually did it, And so I felt like I had to. And so what happened was Hillary Frank was working as an editor on a sort of a temporary editor on a show called Weekend America that was an American public media show that was produced out of LA. And so I guess she probably sent emails out to a bunch of producers she knew, asking them if they had any pitches for the show. And she sent one to me, and I knew I wanted to do this radio drama show, and I thought this is a good opportunity because it was a very open-ended format show, and you could do all kinds of stuff with that show. And it was one of the few really truly open format shows on public radio, and so I pitched her this. I wanted to do. I had also been taking improv classes, for a number of reasons. One was because I had been working on the comedy show, but also I knew I wanted to work with improvisers on this radio drama project, and I was sort of like scouting out performers and thinking a lot about how I might actually go about doing that. And I went to a lot of improv performances in those days, and when I would go, I would think, wow, this would be great if someone just gave it a really good edit. This could actually work on the radio. And then working with Radiolab and seeing how they basically were using improv, a different kind of improv, but they were basically improvising their way around storytelling. I thought, well, maybe, what if I took that approach to writing, but instead of doing, documentaries, I applied it to a fiction piece. And so I pitched that idea to Hillary. I said, I want to try to do something with improvisers. Just get them in the recording studio. We'll do something, just so it's it's useful, we'll peg it to Valentine's Day. Because this was like, I think I was pitching it in November or something, and so it was basically looking at the calendar and saying, well, okay, it'll take us 2 months. Give us 2 months to do it. Right. And so Valentine's Day, just to narrow it down, I said, okay, it's about being alone on Valentine's Day. And so I got a group of improvisers. I auditioned improvisers with the help of Eliza Skinner, who was one of the improvisers, actors I ended up working with. And we got 3 really great improvisers together, and they came into the studio, and we actually used Radiolab Studio, and we recorded for like 4 hours one weekend, and I didn't have anything. It was like nothing. Nothing was working. I was like, none of this is gonna work. This isn't gonna fly. They're not gonna want to put this on the radio, and so I was like, well, let's come back next week and try it again, and I'll try to figure something out. And so I went home and I listened to the tape, I edited it, and there's one idea, I thought maybe there might be something in the tape I could use, and there's one idea that they kind of landed on about Valentine's Day traditions, and I thought, well, maybe there's something in that. I think there's a real story in that. And I was talking with Hillary on the phone and telling her about what had happened and how it was going, and she said, well, what if there were like 2 people with competing traditions that were in conflict? I said, yeah, but what if one of the traditions is like calling people? And I'm like, okay, yeah, that was good. Okay, that was enough to go on. And so I brought the improvisers back the next week, and we basically made the bulk of what became Eat Cake, and which is on our podcast feed now, and then they came back a third time and finished it up, and so that was a big learning experience, but it was also, what happened was, so it was scheduled to air on Valentine's Day, and in mid-January, we found out that Weekend America had been canceled, and its last show was January 29th.
Oh, jeez.
and so it was like, my whole plan was that, okay, I'll do this piece and hopefully it'll be good, and then I'll like do one of these pieces a month for this show, and that'll be my job, and that's how I'll get the show happening. And that was clearly not going to happen. But they did. The executive producer of the show, Peter Clowney, had heard what we were doing, and Hillary had heard what we were doing, and she, and they liked it. They really liked how the piece was, and so they said, well, we'll put this on our last episode, even though it's a Valentine's Day piece. We'll still put it on the very last episode, and so it aired, and Week in America ended, and I was talking to Hillary about what I wanted to do. I was telling her that I wanted to start this show, and she had written a lot of fiction. She had actually was a published fiction writer, and I asked her if she wanted to work on it with me, and she said, well, it just so happens I know that Peter Clowney is moving into a development position at American Public Media, and we could pitch him the show. And so Peter was receptive to it. We spent the next 9 months or so working up a pitch, like a proposal, a detailed proposal with a budget and everything for APM, for this radio drama show, this sort of fiction, audio fiction. And we were going to call it The Truth. That's where we came up with the name The Truth. Hillary Frank came up with the name. And so we pitched it. Peter was able to get us a little bit of money to produce 2 pieces. And one of those pieces was Moon Graffiti, which is on our podcast. And it was almost exactly what's on our podcast feed, I think, is what I handed it in. So it was that piece along with a piece that Hillary had made that hasn't, I don't think it's been heard. And so APM, so we handed those in in January of, I think it must have been 2010. and we waited for 6 months with no answer, and finally, like in like June or July, Peter said, "Well, they're not gonna do it, but I think you should like release this piece and let everyone hear it because this is a great piece." And so I put the piece on PRX, which is like this, like a content depot for independent producers where you can put your work and then stations can license it. And so I put it up there, and it became the most listened to piece that year. And I got a meeting with like Lionsgate Films out of it,
Wow.
and it was featured on this, all that was probably the result of it being featured on this, what at the time was an email newsletter called Very Short List, that Kurt Anderson ran or was a part of creating. And Kurt Anderson is the host of Studio 360, and so I had sent him a copy of the piece, and he liked it and said, "You guys should feature this." So that's how that happened. And so that piece got a lot of attention. It got heard by a lot of people, and I really liked how it turned out. And so, I'm sorry, this is like a long story. I don't know how interesting this is. You can feel free to edit any of this because I'm not. Don't let me. I don't want to judge what's interesting and what's not. But
No, I think it's all interesting personally.
that's good. And so. We're talking to Peter about how do we make this show happen, because it wasn't like a definitive no at APM. It was more like, they're kind of, they're not sure. I think, and Peter really liked the idea, and Peter really wanted to try to find a way to make it happen there, and he was always very supportive, like always, like all along. He said, "Well, if you guys got a piece on This American Life, then I think that would give me something to point to my bosses. I could say, look, Ira likes this. You guys should consider this." And so, Hillary had worked there a lot. Her husband's actually a producer there now. I don't think he was at the time, but he might have been. I don't know. And so we got a meeting with Ira, and he listened to the Eat Cake piece, and he listened to the Moon Graffiti piece, and he didn't want to air either one of them, but he saw something in the Eat Cake piece that he liked. He thought that it was really the sort of the fake documentary type of approach, and then the phone call, it worked really well on the radio. There were a lot of really positive things about it, and so he said, "Well, if you can pitch me an idea that I like, I will pay you this much money, and then if I end up airing it, I'll pay you a little bit extra." And so I pitched him like 3 or 4 different ideas, a bunch of ideas, and finally he said yes to one. And that piece ended up becoming Tape Delay.
Which is excellent as well.
Oh, thank you.
I love that one too.
And so I ended up working on that piece for like a year. So by this time it's like 2011, and I worked on it with Ed Herbstman, who played Buzz Aldrin in the Moon piece, who also is a very he started Magnet Theater in New York, which is an improv theater. They have classes and shows, and so he was just a really good person to know, and knows a lot of people, is very talented, very good actor, and he knew Tammy Sager from, I think they'd worked together at Second City in Chicago, but she was living in LA at the time. But she's a really amazing improviser. She's also a brilliant writer. She does a lot of television, and she was going to be the other actor in the story, and we worked on it for a real long time, because I would send drafts to Ira, and then it would take him like 2 months to get back to me, or maybe like it would take him like a month, and he'd say, like after a month, he'd say, I love it. I think this is really great. I just have a few notes. I can't give them to you now. I don't have time to give them now, but I'll get back to you soon with the notes. And then another month would go by, and I'd finally get notes from him, right? And that happened a few times. And so that's mostly why it took a long time. But it was also just a really hard piece to write. I didn't really know what I was doing in terms of writing fiction at the time. I was trying to figure it out, and it was hard to do. At least that didn't come easily to me. And so I spent a lot of time, and I think it was, I got these ideas to do things with manipulating the recordings and it was just a very long process. And anyway, I eventually, by the end of 2011, we had a finished piece. We had it was in good shape. We liked it for the most part. It maybe needed a little bit more work, but it was pretty close. And he said, okay, at first he was going to air it in February, and then that ended up getting bumped for something else. And he said, but that's okay. I'm still going to air it. I just don't know when. I think in April. And so I thought, okay.
Something about that month of February for you, Jonathan.
Yeah. And so this was the beginning. This is like January of 2012. I said, okay, he's going to air it in April. So that gives me time to set up a website. I need to have a website. I need to have someplace to go. And it gives me time. What I'll do is, like at that time, like podcasting was not that, was not at all a mainstream thing. It was like, Mark Maron was podcasting. Mark Maron was a really successful podcaster. And Roman had been podcasting a little bit, but, not a lot of people were doing it. And it was more like in the case of Mark Maron, it was like a fail-safe kind of like last resort. If you couldn't make your project happen on the radio, if you couldn't get on the radio, then you could do a podcast, right? And so this is like, okay, I'll make a podcast. And I was talking to Roman to Ed Herbstman about this, and about how I wanted to make this show and how I was having trouble getting it started at APM. And he said, well, I have this theater that I helped start, and I know a lot of performers who would work for free if you don't need to get paid. I think that they'd work with you. And so I said, yeah, let's just do it for free. Let's just see what we can do. No one's jumping up to give me money. I just want to practice too. Cause I felt like I needed to become a better storyteller, and I needed to kind of start doing it all the time and really make it a regular part of my life. And so I got this group of improvisers together. We started meeting every week at the Magnet Training Center, with the goal that we're going to start a podcast feed, new stories for the podcast. After working on that piece for a year for This American Life, I just wanted to do something in a month. Like I want to do something very quick. And so I said, okay, our goal is to just do a brand new story, conception to completion, 1 month. And in the meantime, I put Moon Graffiti up on the podcast feed. I put Eat Cake up on the podcast feed. I put a couple other pieces I'd done. This Terry Bisson piece, They're Made Out of Meat, which I'd done for Studio 360. And I'd also done a Kurt Anderson story that I put up later that year that basically I got that opportunity because of Moon Graffiti. But anyway, I had a number of pieces in my back catalog that I knew I could put up there. And so while we were working on, and so the piece that the first piece we ended up making with that group was Interruptible, which we recorded. It takes place in a taxi cab in a single evening. And we rented a car, and because no one owns cars in New York, and we drove all over Manhattan and recorded it in like 5 hours, just driving around in Manhattan, and we made that piece, and we put that up, and then we made a piece. Chet Siegel had an idea for a piece that took place in spin class, and so we did that. And I wanted to do something with, anyway, we had all these ideas for stories, and we started just making stories, and April came around. But at this time, we had the podcast feed going. We were maybe like a good day, maybe we would have gotten 200 or 300 downloads. It was like nothing. It was not very much traffic. And This American Life piece finally airs, and that
kaboom,
that Monday, boom, like 20,000 downloads a day. And then it was like that for a couple weeks, and the podcast was the #1 podcast on iTunes for 2 weeks.
The power of Ira.
Yeah. and we were in business, we had a podcast. And
you know what, Jonathan, I want to ask you about something during that time window, because I don't want you to mention it in passing, because and I'm not saying this to blow smoke or to overstate, but I truly believe this. If my dates are correct from what I'm looking at, during 2012 as well, at least according to the Truth Podcast Wikipedia entry, who knows how accurate that is, I believe this was early on as well. There is possibly my favorite ever podcast episode of any show I've ever heard.
Wow.
and I mean that. And I'm somebody who listens, Jonathan, 6 to 8 hours a day and have been doing so for about 8 years.
Wow.
This one literally made me stop and be like, what have I just heard? And it blew my mind. And I'd love for you to tell folks a little bit about it, and that's the one titled "That's Democracy."
Oh, yeah.
With the teacher and the students. I know that was fairly big from looking at SoundCloud statistics and stuff. It looks like that one got a lot of traction as well. But can you tell folks a little bit about how that came about? Because this one literally blew my mind.
So, so that was later that same year. So we were looking for ways. We were doing this for free, and so we were looking for ways of making money from it. And I was working with Carrie Hillman at this point. Hillary wasn't involved with the project at all, and I had started working with Carrie Hillman, who was my producer friend who I'd worked on the Fair Game show with, and so she suggested that we pitch an hour special to PRX. So that way they could give us, whatever it was, a few $1,000s or something to create an hour-long thing. And so our idea that we pitched them, because everyone likes specials that you can peg to a specific date because they're easy to market to stations, or easier to market to stations. If it's not a specific date like a holiday, then it would need to be like a news story or something like that will have traction. But in our case, we were looking at the calendar, and this was, we're looking at the end of the year. We said, well, let's see, around the time when we'd want to do this, there's Halloween. Everyone's going to do a Halloween special. That's like saturated. And then we said, well, there's elections. Oh my God, there's going to be so much election coverage. It's totally saturated. And then and Ed, sort of joking, said, why don't we do like a Halloween election special? And we all looked around and said, yeah, a Halloween election special, like Halloween or election day horror stories.
Oh, you might have to bring this back again this year, just as a side note.
Yeah, right. It's 4 years later. It's about time.
It kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Go on, sorry.
And so we pitched the idea to PRX, and they liked it. And so the idea was to do a series of, and incidentally, we also pitched the same, like SoundCloud was asking for applications for fellows, and we pitched it to them as well. And so we got funding from both SoundCloud and PRX to do it. And we, the idea being that we would produce, I think 3 or 4 of these stories that were all basically horror stories set within the world of electoral politics. And then we would do one that was maybe, I think we wanted to do something that, because of the SoundCloud thing, we did one that was incorporated crowdsourcing somehow, like people sending us recordings. And so the crowdsource piece became The Death of Poe, because a listener, Matthew Mercier, had sent us a story that about Edgar Allan Poe. But That's Democracy was one of those stories that came out of that project. And it started when Lewis Kornfeld brought in an idea about doing something about a monster, like a group of people who have to vote on what to do about a monster that's outside of the room that they're in. So, and that was the starting point for the idea. And we're trying to figure out how to make that work. And I think he came back the next week with, it's a teacher. I think maybe I don't know how we arrived at it, because we do a lot of group brainstorming, and we just sort of bounce ideas around and try to find the one that sticks. And we arrived at this idea of a teacher who it makes his students vote on who gets to live in the classroom. And I think the initial idea was that he was going to kill one of them, and they all had to vote on who that student would be. And my strong feeling was that it shouldn't be the student who died. It should be a lesson in representative democracy, and that they're voting on the person who would choose who gets to die, because that to me seemed like a more direct analogy of the kind of government we have, And I felt like that would make the story actually a little bit more relevant. And so that was the idea. We worked on the outline for a while. The lead actor in it, Peter McNerney, has worked a lot with students, and so he kind of could get into the mindset of a teacher. He knew how, he could kind of put himself in that place. Got some really great actors, including Russ Armstrong, who I had worked with me on the Made Out of Meat piece, and also Alexis Lambright and Fiona Bradford, and a friend of mine, just a social friend, is the principal of a high school in the Bronx, and it was the summertime, and so school wasn't in session. So I said, "Can we just come stop by and use a classroom for like 3 hours?" And she graciously agreed. And so all the actors, we all met up at the high school. And I had actually asked for 2 days, but we got everything we needed in 1 day. And so we actually recorded it in a high school classroom. The script is actually more of an outline than what we do now. Nowadays, we do things that are much more fully scripted. But these were all improvising actors. They were very comfortable improvising, and we recorded it. It was like a lot of improv, a lot of trying lots of different things out. And I remember that the week that story went up on the podcast feed, I was in Australia giving a workshop about our podcast. And Australia is like 180 degrees out of phase with the United States in terms of like the time zone. And so I could not sleep at all. And so I'd just basically stay up all night working on That's Democracy. I was like editing it on the plane out there, and finishing up in my hotel room, and I finally finished it. And they had scheduled, there was I guess you call it it's not like a concert, but it's like a live presentation of audio pieces, right? So it's like you play recordings of radio pieces in front of a live audience, like like a film. And so they had one of these scheduled for that Thursday night, I believe. And so they said, "Well, what would you like to play?" I said, "Well, I have this new piece I just finished. Let's put it up." And so it was the first time I'd played it for really anyone except for Ed, because he was there with me. And
I'm just imagining what this is like in a group setting.
Yeah. And it was really exciting. I was like, "My God, this works. This piece works. Wow." Because they were totally into it. And
I can imagine. I mean, there's so many great episodes you've done at The Truth, but that one has always stood so at the tip top for me. And I can't imagine how a group would. I was going to ask you about where it was recorded, because it did sound exactly like a classroom. Now it makes sense. It actually was a classroom.
Yeah.
But from that group, as well as kind of the broader sense, was there anything special about sort of the listener reaction to that episode? I mean, because you covered not just the obvious things about the topic matter with democracy and some of the statements the teacher makes, but just sort of guns and schools and all these other covering so many different things. What was the reception like?
Yeah, it takes the whole premise of the idea of a school shooting and it turns it on its head.
Right.
It was interesting. I mean, it was very, very. I mentioned that we had done it as part of this project for the PRX special, and we actually had one piece too many for that special, but I had included That's Democracy because it was my favorite one, and I turned in the hour to PRX and they said you can't put this piece in the show. They said sorry, we're not allowing it. and so luckily we had another piece to replace it with, and that was disappointing. But it's also it's the one piece from that bunch I think that really people still seem to talk about and want to play. In fact, I just told
a coworker today. I just sent him the SoundCloud link today. I said, you have to listen to this.
They just played it on the radio in Australia last week.
Wow. It's and folks, make sure you go back and check this out. I mean, obviously, you need to be subscribing to The Truth if you haven't already after this conversation. And there are so many great episodes. We're not going to be able to touch all of them, but and I want to ask you, Jonathan. That's my personal kind of. If you've never listened to The Truth, check this one out. If somebody's never heard anything from The Truth so far, is there one or two that you are, I don't know if most proud of, if these are all like your children, it's kind of hard to pick one, or, point them to one or two episodes that you think would be great starting points for a new Truth listener?
I really like Sylvia's Blood. I think the sound design on that really worked out well. It's an adaptation of a Philip K. Dick story. And I also like Can You Help Me Find My Mom, which just won an award.
Yeah, I do know that one. Yep.
And that's about a. I won't give it away. It's better if I don't tell you what that's about. It's about a little girl who can't find her mom, but there's more going on than that. And I also like, of the recent pieces, I really like. Visible is I think a pretty strong piece. I think the acting in that is amazing. I think Remember the Babies also has very strong acting. These are all like more recent pieces, I guess, but I really like Songonauts, which is the one that just went up a couple weeks ago.
What's that process been like? My audience has heard from Jonathan Mann 2 weeks ago. They've heard Jonathan Mann's side of it. Well, from your perspective, kind of how did this all come together, and what's it like been sort of working with Jonathan in kind of a different approach for The Truth?
Yeah, he's great. I love working with Jonathan Mann. He's really just full of enthusiasm. He's a brilliant songwriter, and just has all kinds of energy, and is really just so easy to work with. So what happened was I got an email from him saying he had this idea for a series, and would I be willing to meet and talk with him about it. Maybe give him feedback on it, and maybe suggest possible writers for him to work with. He was looking for someone, maybe some way to make this happen. Would I be willing to meet him for lunch? And so we met, and I felt like we just got along really well. I really got a nice, good feeling about it. I loved the idea. I thought it kind of fit. It's a different kind of thing than what we do, but it's also has a lot of the same elements, and it sounded like a fun thing. It sounds something like that would play to my strengths as a producer, because my background's in music, and it would be just fun to do. I just wanted to be a part of it. I just wanted I want to do this. I really want to make this happen. I think it could work really, it'd be really cool. And so we just started working on it, and he's very disciplined person. He does a song a day, which in itself speaks to his discipline. And so we, which is exactly the kind of person you want to be working with, because things get done, And so we met every week. We'd meet for 3 hours and just hash out the story and hash out the world and try to figure out what is this going on. And we spent a good 3 months on it, I'd say. There's a lot of stuff to work out, because we were trying to make something that could be more than just one story, but needed to be, extendable ad infinitum. And we spent more time than usual casting it, and just try to do it as good as we could. And that's basically it. We our first episode went up 2 weeks ago. Our next episode of that series is going to go up in June, so it's a 2-month gap, and then in between, I have another sort of a more regular truth story that's going up in 2 weeks, and then we're going to come back in September with a new story every 2 weeks. So 8 stories between September and the end of the year, and every other story will be a Song and Knots story. And
awesome.
And the reason I'm taking that break is because my wife's having a baby, so it's sort of like
congratulations.
Thank you.
That's great.
So I need a little extra time to do that.
You're completely allowed. I wanted to mention, I alluded to a little bit earlier, transom.org had a couple of entries from you. One of them was from January of 2014, using music. And I imagine a lot of that kind of goes into specifically what you're doing with Song and Knots, but also for all the Truth episodes. And folks, I'm going to link to that article as well, because if you're a podcaster, you want a kind of a real behind-the-scenes technical look at what goes into assembling some of these episodes we're talking about. This can just give you just an introduction to imagine what a lot of this work is like. But I don't want to harp on that too much, and I want to be respectful of your time, Jonathan, but this wouldn't be a complete conversation if we didn't mention, at least, you mentioned, we were talking earlier about American Public Media and then you setting up the podcast feed, but ultimately the Truth did find a home, and it was sort of the topic of conversation that Roman and I had when I brought up the Truth to him, when I called it the most underrated Radiotopia show in the whole family, and he didn't disagree with me when I called the Truth that in my conversation, and obviously it landed with Radiotopia. Can you talk a little bit about being a part of that collective and what the experience has been for you guys?
Sure, yeah. It's basically saved the podcast. It's why we're still around, frankly. It makes it possible for me to do this. It made it possible for it to become my full-time job, like legitimately, like I'm actually making enough money to live off of it. What happened was, I just done a fundraiser for the podcast where we raised $30,000 just on my own, and that was a lot of hard work, and Roman sent me an email, said, "Hey, do you have time to talk on the phone? I'm thinking about starting a new network." And so we talked on the phone, and he told me, at that point, I think the only other person he'd had on, other producer was Ben Walker, and so I said, yeah, I love this idea. This is perfect for my show. I would love to be a part of it. Let's do it. I want to do it. And so he said, okay, well, we're still waiting to hear if we got the money, but I'll count you in, and then I'll be in touch and let you know how it's going. And so that was like in August, I think. And we all met that November, and at that point it was me and Ben and Nick Vanderkolk and Brendan Walker from Love and Radio, and Leah Tao, and I think that was it, just 5 shows, and Roman, and then Joe Richmond came on, and the Kitchen Sisters, and so when we launched the network, it was 7 shows. So that was. And it's great. I mean, they just sort of being associated with that group of producers, all of whom I have a tremendous amount of respect for, is just incredibly helpful. It just kind of legitimizes what we do, and it makes it easier to grow our audience. We can cross promote each other, and my audience is grown by 5 times as big as it was when we started. And we do these group fundraisers, which is a big help. They have an advertising person who helps place ads, and then we just have this sort of the community of producers who are all, we all own our shows. It's not like we're working for Radiotopia. It's like it's a collective, and Radiotopia is basically like their job is to help us do our jobs better, but we still retain. That's the beautiful thing about it, is that we still retain ownership of our show. And that means that I have to treat it like a small business, right. And there's a lot more responsibility on my end, But it also, at the same time, I mean, that's good because our show's destiny is much more in my hands. It's not like if I had started it at a station, that insisted on owning the show, then I would basically be at their mercy in terms of like whether we got to continue or not, and I would be constantly praying that they still liked us, And this way, like as long as we're still making enough money from ads or however we're making it, or donations or whatever, we can still do it, and I feel that's a really liberating place to be as a producer. I mean, it's still a lot of pressure because you have to maintain it, and you have to, audiences can be fickle, and you want to make things that are worth hearing, and you also like, you never have quite enough money, and so it's like, you want to grow the audience so that you have more stability, but that's sort of like how to do that is always, there's always an element of mystery to it, and so it's kind of an adventure, but Radiotopia really makes it so much easier, and they're all smart people. They are very, very helpful to have on your side. I was going to say,
do you guys ever like get calls or emails from each other, like you run into an issue or want to bounce something off each other? Like how much workshopping amongst Radiotopia hosts and creators happens, or is that really not a thing?
I would say that it happened more in the beginning than it does now. There's more shows now, and so I feel like it's a lot. Like the more shows we get, the more sort of estranged we are from one another.
Right. Just a bigger room, right?
Yeah. But I mean, this morning, for example, I just hung out with Benjamin Walker this morning. I went to see the studio he's using on the Lower East Side, and we talked, and he just had a baby too, so we had a lot to talk about. So I mean, there's like it's almost like we work together, but we're all kind of like independent spirited people. So we get to have that too, so it's nice.
Well, I'll tell you what, I firmly believe in that ever growing, more crowded room, because I know Radiotopia is probably looking to add at least one more this year, right? With the podcast movement, with the current efforts, what have you. In that crowded room, for the truth to have such an impact and do the work that you guys are doing in terms of representing not only the banner of the truth, but also as a member of Radiotopia, I think is something that you and everyone that you work with should just feel great about, because to me, it's one of the shining stars of Radiotopia, and that's not to discredit anyone else, because I love just about every show there. But I really love the work that you guys are doing there, and I just cannot recommend folks checking it out, more than I do.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really nice to hear.
We're running long here, and I want to, again, make sure I'm respectful of your time. So before we go, can you please give people just where they can find everything, your social media stuff, the website, if they want to learn more about the truth?
Sure. So our website is thetruthpodcast.com. Our Songonauts project has its own website address, although it's part of the same website, which is songonauts.com. You can access both of those through each other. We have a Twitter account, The Truth Fiction. We are on Facebook. If you do, I think our address is facebook.com/thetruthpodcast. And there's links to all this stuff from our website. So it's pretty easy. If you can just go to our website, then you can find pretty much whatever you'd want. There's Instagram, Tumblr, that kind of stuff.
All that fun stuff. And folks, I'm going to have links to all of that in the show notes as well as the 2 Transom articles we only briefly touched on, but I highly recommend you read as well. Make sure you check those out. Jonathan Mitchell, thank you very much for taking the time here to join me. It was a real privilege and pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Great. Folks, that'll do it for this week on the Podcast Digest for episode 89. Back next week with episode 90 with another great conversation with one of your favorite podcasts, or soon to be one. Until then, my name's Dan Lizette. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter @PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.